They tell you not to get too friendly with the inmates. Statistically, 45% of prison staff will have an unwise encounter with an inmate at some point in their career. What this translates to varies from person to person, but in my case, it was a little worse than most. I lost it all, and all because I talked a little too much with an inmate. "Morning, Sarge." That was inmate Howard's usual greeting. He'd been in maximum security for as long as I could remember. He'd been sentenced to life in prison for a string of murders he'd committed against women. He'd gotten himself a cell in maximum security because he'd killed at least 3 roommates. Now he was housed alone, got his meals in a styrofoam tray, and only got rec once a week, and only then under the closest of scrutiny. If ever oh ever there was a bad guy in prison, it was inmate Howard. That being said, I'd never had any trouble out of him. He was always polite. He never sat at the door and ogled nurses when they came to pass meds. He never kicked the door or threw his shit, and was generally well behaved as far as inmates go. He read a lot, never really talked to anyone, and mostly kept to himself. He didn't even really speak to the other COs, except for me. I was the only one that had more to say to him than shut up. His conversations started off light. He was a football fan, and he wanted to know how his team was doing as I passed mail. What sort of movies were in theaters while I handed out lunch? How was I, or how was the health of my family while I pushed around the laundry cart? Standard stuff, conversation starters. Pretty typical of inmates locked in a cell for 23 hours a day. I kept my responses casual at first, 1 or 2 word answers, but after a while, you start getting used to people. Inmates are criminals, they're bad guys, but you see them as often as you see your friends after a while. I was never friends with them. That's never a good idea. You do become relaxed after a while, though. You let your guard down. You start to discuss last night's football game with them. You talk about how the new Judge Dredd movies are so much better than the old ones. You ask them about their families, and you tell them a little bit about yours. You start to look at them like animals in a zoo. The animals are behind bars and thus no threat to you. You get relaxed. You get comfortable looking and stepping a little closer to the bars than you usually would. You forget that the animals still have claws and horns and teeth. You forget that the animals are still animals. I was sitting at his cell one afternoon, sorting mail and passing a word, when he suddenly told me something that made me look up from my mail sack. I'd gotten comfortable enough talking with him and made a habit of it almost every afternoon. I never spent long out there, just a few minutes of conversation, and we usually talked about the sort of thing he could learn about if he took the time. We had just finished talking about the Cowboys, a team we both liked, and their miserable loss last weekend, when he suddenly asked me if I believed in God. I rolled my eyes, expecting a jailhouse sermon. "My God, Howard, don't tell me how you found Jesus in this hellish place." "Nope, not sure he even exists. Don't see how he could if he'd give a man like me this condition." "Condition? Your condition came from murdering all those women. I don't think Jesus had much to do with that, Howard." "No, not that condition." He paused, looking around conspiratorially. "Sarge, if I tell you something, will you promise not to tell anyone else?" I perked my ears up. It wasn't uncommon to get a cell-side confession from some of these guys. They were hard to a point, but eventually their crimes began to weigh on them at night. So they tell some officer their sins so he can go tell the captain, and he can tell the warden so he can tell the families of the victims, and the victims can get some closure. I didn't know if that's what this was, but I was curious nonetheless. "Sure, I promise." He leaned against the glass and whispered into the little ventilator grate, "I can't die." I laughed. I couldn't help it. "Yeah, good thing they gave you life then. Not being able to die would put a real damper on a death sentence." He looked at me through the glass, and I could tell that he was absolutely serious. I gave him a stern look. "There is no way. Get the hell out of here. No one is immune to death, Howard." Howard stepped back into his cell and seemed to ignore me. He sat on his bunk and stared at the floor, and I kept passing mail. There was no way. This was a classic inmate game of see if I can get one over on the CO. Once I bought it, he'd laugh and tell the quad how he'd got me, and they'd all laugh at me too. When I finished his quad, I looked back at his cell, and he was standing at the door again. Howard was wearing the same determined look that I'd seen earlier, and for a moment, I wanted to talk to him and clear things up. If he hurt himself because of this, I could get into some real trouble. I put it out of my mind, though, and went about my routine. It was almost time to leave, and I wanted to be out of the door when 6 o'clock rolled around. Howard didn't bring it up again until the next day. I came around with the lunch trays and noticed that he was standing in the back of his cell. He was naked from the waist up, his chest a tapestry of scars and mostly healed burns, and he was pressing a shank to the spot where his heart should be. I scrambled for my keys as I fumbled for my gas, intending to spray him before he could stab himself. Before I could get the flap open, he had already plunged the knife in. He backed into the wall, his knees giving way as his blood pumped out of his chest. I felt my numb fingers reaching for my radio to call for help. I had just drawn it to my mouth when he hit the door, the hole in his chest already closing, and drug the wet knife across the glass. "Believe me now?" he said, his voice completely even. The radio buzzed to life. Whoever was in the booth must have noticed me hit the door and thought something was going on. I keyed up the radio and told him that everything was okay as I watched the knife slide out from under the cell door and bump my foot. Howard stepped back, hands raised, a big grin on his face like a magician at the end of a particularly good trick. I still insisted that he go to medical. I told them that he had told me about a bad nosebleed, and when the captain saw how much blood was in his cell, he agreed. We shackled him, cuffed him, and took him down the path to medical, his chest and pants awash with blood. I agreed to sit with him in medical, and after the nurse looked him over, we sat in the exam room and waited to be released. That was where he told me the whole story. When I was 6, Dad came home drunk and broke my neck during a beating. I thought I was dead, lying on the floor while Mom screamed between punches, waiting to float off to wherever came next. When I didn't die, I realized that my neck wasn't broken. It had been. I knew it had been, but it wasn't anymore. My mother cried over me, tears streaming out of her raccoon eyes, and that was when I realized that I was different. When I was 16, a cop shot me 3 times in the chest during a robbery. I spent 3 years in juvie, but I was also deemed a medical miracle. I've been stabbed, burned, shot, thrown out of and off of things, and I always come back just fine. I listened to his story, unsure I would believe it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. That's why I wanted to tell you about it, Sarge. When my dad broke my neck, it was 1901. Dad was a coal miner, Mom was a homemaker, and I've seen the rise and fall of a century. I've looked 30 since I was 20, and I'll go right on looking 30 forever if I choose to. The thing is, I'm tired of living. It's a curse to live this long, especially here, and I want to die. There's only one way I can do it, though. He leaned in close, his chains clinking as they kept him strapped to the bed. I have to give this power to someone. I leaned away from him, his breath reeking of unbrushed teeth. "And you want to give it to me?" I said dubiously. "You're always one of the good ones, Sarge. You treat us fairly, like people, and that means something to us. I want you to have this curse. Maybe you can do more with it than I could." I'd be a liar if I said the idea of living forever didn't appeal to me. Having unlimited time to pursue the things I loved, not having to worry about time getting away from me, being able to enjoy life until I was ready for it to end. The word curse kept rattling around in my brain, but I honestly was having trouble seeing it as a curse. As I lay next to my wife that night, I imagined outliving her and our son. Maybe that was the curse. Maybe Howard had watched the people he loved die over the years. Maybe that was the terrible part. I mulled it over for a week before I finally gave him my answer. We were taking them out for cell cleanup, and as Howard stood there, ankles chained and hands cuffed behind his back, I moved next to him to ask my question. "So, say I wanted to take this power. How do we do it?" He smiled, knowingly. "I've been thinking about it for a while, huh?" "Well, yeah, you have to admit it's a tempting offer." He nodded, but said nothing. "So how does it work?" I asked impatiently. "We shake hands, and you say, 'I take this burden unto myself.'" "That's it?" I asked incredulously. "That's it," he said. He turned to look at me then, and the look in his eyes should have told me all I needed to know. His face was calm, but his eyes were hungry to be rid of this curse. His eyes burned with a secret desire, a desire unknown to anyone who hadn't been trapped in a cage like he had. His whole body seemed to vibrate as he extended his hand. If I hadn't been so eager, no, greedy is a better word. If I hadn't been so greedy, I would have seen the look and never come close enough to touch him again. Instead, I reached out and shook his hand without a second thought, saying the words exactly as he had said them. I take this burden unto myself. That is when the most intense feeling of vertigo I had ever felt hit me. My vision doubled, tripled, swam like a pool of turbulent water. For a minute that was locked in eternity, I could feel my very being as it was siphoned from me and spat back by a giant lung. I was turned into a tornado, bottled in a jar, and poured over a volcano. I cannot adequately describe what happened, but when I returned to myself, everything had changed. I was slumped against the railing, head spinning, and vomit dripping between the grating of the catwalk. My hands hurt, and my legs seemed sluggish. I could hear voices asking if I was okay, but my tongue didn't want to work properly when I tried to respond. As my vision cleared, I was again struck by an odd sense of vertigo as I saw myself coming up from my knees. I stood up and shook my head, testing my hands and looking over at myself as I leaned against the rail. I tried to reach out, but my hands were stuck behind me. I took a step towards myself, but my legs came up short, and I fell on my face on the metal grating. My nose broke, and I was aware of the second most excruciating pain in my life. I rolled over, spitting blood, and I could see myself standing over me. When I smiled, I felt cold horror spreading over me. Howard's smile was spreading across my face. "What happened?" one of the COs asked, coming out of the cell and looking at Howard as he stood over me. "This inmate lunged at me. I had to put him down before he hurt himself," Howard said, never taking his eyes off me. "That's so," the CO said. "I think his name was Taylor, but who remembers? Want me to call the captain down here so we can start some paperwork?" "Nah, I think he's had enough. Help me get him back in the cell," Howard said. They moved me back into Howard's cell, grabbing me under the arms. Once the leg restraints came off, they walked out and closed the door. I struggled to my feet and ran to the little window, but Howard was already leaving the quad. Officer Taylor told me to put my hands through the flap so he could get the cuffs off. I tried to explain to him, tried to tell him how I was not inmate Howard, how inmate Howard had put my mind in his body, but the things I was saying were a hard sale at best. Taylor stared at me through the glass, blankly listening to what I was saying in the same way I had listened to 1,000 other inmates. He heard my words, crazy as they sounded, but he let them wash over him before he again told me to give up the cuffs before he had to call the captain down here. I put my hands out, and he took them off. I tried to tell him what had happened again, but he closed the flap and moved on, leaving me in an 8x10 cell with nothing but my own confused emotions. That first night was the worst night of my life. I paced the cell, eating and drinking nothing, as my mind ran around my head like a trapped rat. I hadn't seen Howard for the rest of the day, and it didn't do any good to try to talk to any of the other officers. They just thought I was talking crazy talk to get sent to psych, or ignored me as I raged against the glass. I didn't sleep that night. After lights out, I walked and screamed and yelled my frustration out amongst the other prisoners that screamed for me to shut the hell up. If you've never been inside one of those cells with the door closed, you can't imagine how small it feels. Knowing that you have no escape from that hell is pure madness. Knowing that no one will come if something should happen to you is pure hell. I understand after that night why so many inmates go insane. I worried about my wife and son the most. What if Howard found his way to my house? Wearing my face, my wife would greet him, let him in without question. What would he do to them? Would he hurt them? Thinking like that made me scream all over again, and by morning, I feared my vocal cords had been damaged. The juice they gave me with breakfast helped my raw throat, but did little for my mental anguish. After the first night, I found a numb little hole in my mind to crawl into. That was where I lived for the next few weeks. If someone came to give me food, I ate it. If someone came to take me to the shower, I went. If they tried to take me to rec, I ignored them. I slept in a fetal ball on my mat and just let time slip by. Time had ceased to matter anymore. Sometimes I would sleep the whole day, lost in my misery and coldness. The world shrank to an 8x10 concrete box, and the things outside mattered very little. I could hear whispers on the quad, but I ignored them. My name came up often, my old name, that Howard now wore. No one had seen him in a while, and there was talk that something had happened. I had done something bad, and was likely not coming back. I tried to block it out. I held my hands against my ears and refused to listen. But as the details came out, my worst fears were realized. I had murdered my family. I had shot and killed my wife and son. There was evidence of sexual assault on my wife. Neighbors had heard her begging for her life, heard my son screaming as I killed them. He had left afterwards and killed 5 more people. They had caught him in the act and taken him alive. His trial was scheduled for later this month. He was likely to get the death penalty. This information trickled in over the course of weeks. I was privy to it, but did not actively participate. I stopped eating, my eyes constantly running at the thought of my family's suffering. My wife, my son, they were both lost forever. They had died believing that I was their killer. My greed had led to their deaths. As I lay there, I realized I couldn't take the pain. I tried to kill myself the next night. The officer on duty found me hanging from a bed sheet and cut me down, rushing me to medical. It was needless. I had suffered no ill effect. I had never even lost consciousness. Howard had been right. My body refused to die. I could have cut myself, stabbed myself, thrown myself off the bunk, and never even suffered a bit of ill. I'd gained the power I wanted, and now I saw it for the curse it was. I spent a week under medical observation, sitting in a 12x12 concrete room with a big glass window that they could monitor me through. I was dressed in an oversized green smock with Velcro fastenings and given a rip-resistant mattress to sleep on. They gave me pills for the pain, pills for the psychosis, pills for the depression I was likely suffering from, but I didn't take them. I spit them out the second they weren't looking and wallowed in my pain. After a week, they let me go back to my old cell. When I got back, I heard someone calling my name from the nearby window of J-Dorm, Stragview's death house. I bristled when I heard it, the voice as familiar as my own name. I went to the window and looked out across the short expanse. The cell, as if predestined, faced the wall of the death house, and I could see a grinning face looking through the bars at me. The face was a little ragged, a little haggard, but I would have known it anywhere. I was looking at myself. He spent the rest of his time at the back window, trying to get my attention. I had seen inmates do this when I was an officer, talking to each other through the back window grate, but I lay on the floor and ignored him as he called to me. He tried to goad me, telling me how he'd screwed my wife, how my son had cried when he'd beaten him, how they had both suffered before the end. I just lay there and ignored him. He told me about the gas station he'd turned into an abattoir after that, using my own shotgun to kill 3 customers and a clerk. But I went right on ignoring him. He told me how he'd killed a cop before they'd apprehended him, how the cop had wanted to kill him so badly. Told me how the trial judge had said that life was too good for someone like him. But I went right on ignoring him. I've been sentenced to death. I have no attorney, no appeals to file, no chances for retrial. I doubt I'll last more than a year on death row before they execute me. Looks like I finally get to die. I ignored him. He tried to get my attention at every available moment. He told me of the murders again and again. He told me how his life story had been a lie. He told me how he too had been a guard once, how he had taken the same deal and been trapped for years and years as his sanity eroded away. You'll sit here too. In Stragview, no one seems to care about an eternal prisoner. I ignored him until the day they took him off the block and led him to the chair. I was there on the night they executed him. I did not watch from the window. I lay on the floor of my cell in a fetal ball and did not mourn the passing of my old life. I almost thought I could hear him laugh as the lights dimmed and then they came back up again. I was still there when the sun came up. I was there for a lot more sunrises after that. I don't know how long ago that was. Time had no meaning there. Time had no meaning to those trapped in hell. I ate when I had to. I showered when such was offered. I went to rec when it came my turn. The faces of my wife and son faded from my mind, and for that, I was grateful. Their memories are a fiery brand against my soul, and I know I will be made to answer for them someday. I'm writing this from a library terminal in a city I never bothered to learn the name of. I lived on the streets in much the same way I lived in prison. I eat when food comes my way. I sleep when I can find a safe place to. I shower when such things come to pass. Unlike prison, however, I find myself at rec a lot more often. You must realize by now that if I'm out, someone made the same deal I did. I, however, did look back when I left him in that hell forever. His confusion was familiar, but I never looked back again. I kept running, kept moving, and now I feel my sanity beginning to return. It's easy to forget what hell is like once you're out. So if you work in Stragview and an inmate offers you immortality, do yourself a favor. Tell him to shut the hell up and just keep walking. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. There's another Stragview story for you prison short story lovers. And if you love my Stragview stories, I always recommend that you head down to Amazon and pick up a copy of my book. There's 30 Stragview stories there for you to enjoy, and plenty of prison horror for you to incarcerate yourself with. Let's go ahead and thank our sponsors. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle and Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributors. Thanks to Xaronana for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributor. And thanks to Glen Jenkins for being our Ghostly Writer tier contributor. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you too would like to support the show, come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you can have your name read out at the end of every TikTok and every YouTube video that I make. Also, patrons get their videos a day early, so you can enjoy my Wednesday and Friday videos on Tuesday and Thursday. So, what are you waiting for? Come on down and join the club. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.